Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to Cram. Thanks for joining me as we explore new and innovative research and big ideas that may change the way you think and act. Well, last week, if you joined us, we talked about dating in a post pandemic world for people in their 20s and 30s. It was a very enlightening conversation with Kristen Mark, who is a sex and relationships researcher, about how things have changed because of the pandemic. Kristen's back with me today to put a spotlight on older singles who are dating, because there are a lot of changes and challenges in those age groups as well. Kristen Mark is a Canadian behavioral health scientist. She's currently working in the US, and she's a professor at the University of Minnesota at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Health. Hello again, Kristen.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Well, thank you for coming back. I read this stat. Now, this was an American stat, but I'm assuming it kind of applies to Canada too, that more than a third of baby boomers are not married. And we know the divorce rate for people over 50 is rising. And then I was adding to that the fact that people are living longer as well. So I'm guessing there's a good chunk of those people who are dating, or they're looking for someone. What sense do you have of that dating scene for older adults? I don't know how busy it is. What's happening?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the world has kind of opened up in a way for people of that age group because of technological advances that can help facilitate meeting someone new that they didn't have when they were previously dating. I think for some people that's exciting and like something that they want to look into. Whereas for others, it can feel like too foreign or too far away from them being able to access, or they might sort of hold on to these older ideas around what it means to online date, and they might have some of those stigmas attached to it in a way that can be prohibitive in the context of dating when you're older. So I think there are people in both of those camps.
You know what? And I want to just put this on the table too before we even get started. When I was looking into the research into older adults and the kinds of relationships that they're forming, I couldn't find a lot of research. And even the studies that I came across, they actually said that. I mean, they were a bit older studies, but they said, oh, there's not a lot of research on this area. So I was thinking, well, if there's such a big chunk of the population that's older and single and presumably dating as well, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really an understudied area. And one of the reasons that it's so understudied is because of the stigma that's held around older adults and engaging in sexual activity. So we think about that as being like, no one wants to hear about their grandparents engaging in sex, right? I mean, where we should be saying, like, I really hope my grandparents still engage in sex. Like, that should be the sentiment around it, but it just isn't. And so it's sort of this taboo topic that people don't seem to be studying. I will say that it's increasing in its attention. I would say that the research around that has increased in recent years. Robin Milhausen, who's at University of Guelph, actually is doing a big study on midlife adults and sort of what that looks like and what their sex lives are looking like, a nationally representative study in Canada. So I know that there are people doing this work. And there are people who are trying to understand that, because it's about to be the largest population, right? Baby boomers are getting older, and that age group is really important for us to understand. And we live so much longer now, and we live healthier for longer. So you can actually have a healthy sex life and a healthy romantic life well into your 80s and 90s, when before perhaps that wasn't seen as realistic.
Yeah. And when you say, it's important for our grandmothers to be having sex, how important is sex to a healthy relationship?
Incredibly important. Research consistently shows that, your relationship satisfaction and your sexual satisfaction are incredibly intertwined. And so we know that link is there. I think the part that maybe gets lost is that what is sex and what does that look like as you age? And that might change over time. And that's okay. Like, that's actually a good thing that we change our definitions of like what that might look like. But that intimacy, that closeness, that is that a lot of people get through sex is incredibly important for overall well-being, not even just for your relationships, but for your overall health. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, so I'm assuming when you say, well, what is sex, that there may be an assumption by some people that we're talking strictly sexual intercourse, but that may not be the sex that people are practicing as they get older.
Exactly. Yeah, that intercourse centric narrative. I mean, I try with the younger generation to try and bring them away from that, and I think that we're seeing with increased like inclusion and ideas around what a relationship is, and that it's not just a man and a woman, right? Like that is no longer the case. We are seeing this expand. Well, it's never been the case, but it's no longer the social sort of gold standard. And I think with that, we're seeing these definitions of sex being expanded. And a lot of that can apply also to older sexuality, because maybe you're on a medication that means that you know, don't have the same sexual function that you used to have.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you've recently had a surgery, and like that means that you might not have access to similar positions that you would normally like. You know, all of these
Yeah.
things contribute to your sexual life. And so redefining what that looks like and making that part of the fun too. I think of like exploration and figuring out what it is that you actually like.
Yeah, I was trying to imagine, let's just say it's somebody in midlife. I don't know, they're in their 50s. They've been out of the dating game for a while. Maybe they were in a long-term relationship. They had a partner. Now they're single again. I I don't even know. I mean, where do they start? I'm sure many of them are thinking, "Oh my goodness, it's scary. Where do I even start?"
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on your comfort level, right? So if you're open to online dating, it's incredibly accessible, allows for, you know, you to meet people that you wouldn't normally meet. So that's certainly an option, is to go and you can specify age so that you're, you know, within the age range that you're most
Yeah.
interested in. But I think the other thing is to stay active and to continue engaging in the things that you like to do. Not only are you single now, but not you personally, Mary, but
No,
not
I'm still
only,
married.
yeah, right. Not only is that individual single, but there's also lots of others around them that are single. And if you're engaging in the types of activities that you love to do by yourself and with other people, and that person's also engaging in that activity, that automatically gives you an entry point for pursuing the conversation around dating. And different people are comfortable with different levels of what dating looks like after losing a loved one, or, you know, it depends on their age. Like, you also have to have that conversation of like, what are you looking for? Are you looking to get married again, potentially? Are you open to that? Are you looking for, you know, if you have kids who are smaller, what does that mean for this partner? And I think having those conversations about what your expectations are, what you're looking for, that can be really helpful in navigating the dating scene and becoming comfortable having those conversations, because it can sometimes be hard to bring that up.
Yeah, now that and you point out all those different factors. I mean, yeah, you've got kids, maybe you do. How old are they? You've just lived a longer time as well, right? There's more life lived when you're older. I'm wondering, I mean, I know every case is different, but generally speaking, do you think maybe it's tougher for older people to date?
I think it's tougher for a few reasons. In addition to what you just mentioned, it's also can be tougher because I think that stigma does exist. And I also think that depending on how the marriage ended, if you do have kids, like talking to them about navigating seeing someone else, and like all of that can become really complicated.
Hmm.
So that adds up those pieces just add layers that aren't there in these other relationships. Now, that doesn't mean that that can't be navigated. It just means having maybe a few like uncomfortable conversations and really getting at the core of why you want to be in another relationship. Does that bring you happiness and joy? And like, is that why? Well, tell people that. And that can be sort of the launching point for these other conversations of like, I would really like to share my life with someone. in a meaningful way. And this is the way that I'm going to do that. And I want, your buy-in, or
Yeah.
I want to know, how you feel about that.
Yeah, and I would think too, I mean, if you're in your 20s and 30s and you're looking for let's say a more serious relationship, a long-term relationship, I, your expectations probably are going to be different from someone, let's say, who's now single in their 50s. They're probably not going to have kids, right? At that point. Like probably
It
not.
depends. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm
It
just thinking,
depends.
yeah, you're right. It depends. Yeah. But generally speaking, would the expectations of the older single person tend to be different from those
Yeah.
younger people, right? Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And you've had experience of other relationships and you know what works for you and what doesn't. And maybe you've been in a really long-term marriage and you're like, I don't want to live with someone ever again. That like might be
Yeah.
something that you feel that you're
Yeah.
like, I want to live by myself for the rest of my days, for the foreseeable future anyway. And so then that's something that's important to communicate, right? Like making sure that all of those pieces are aligned. There can be more pieces to align. But that said, I think that there's also sort of a lot of flexibility that comes with that. And there's flexibility that comes with being older, to where if you did have kids, those kids are no longer in the house. Like there's a lot of different pieces that can, yeah.
So, I read this really interesting article. It was in the Atlantic, I think. And they were talking to different single people who were older, midlife and older. One thing that struck me, and again, I mean, this wasn't a big study or a survey. It was just, these people they were talking to, but just the fact that they were now, or were now at a time when they could try different kinds of relationships that they previously never had been either exposed to, or they couldn't, for whatever reasons. And so, I mean, as much as we were just talking about how it can be difficult, there are more layers to dating when you're older. It also seemed to me there were more choices. And
Yeah.
I don't know if people are actually acting on that.
I'm not sure. I mean, and this is where the data, we just don't have the data to
Yeah.
show this, right? I would love, I wish that we did have data to support that.
But as you were saying, though, like I was even reading about some older singles, they chose not to get married. They didn't have to get married.
Yep.
So, they were in long-term relationships. Some of them didn't even live together. They decided to maintain separate residences. Other people, who were heterosexual their whole lives, they wanted to try different kinds of sexual relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, this is, you know what I mean? It's just sort of broadening their choices.
You can throw those really strict scripts out the window, right? We end up getting confined by these scripts as we're growing up, which are so problematic in such a variety of ways. And when you're dating an older and you're older and you're sort of exploring your sexuality in this like new light, and your sexual life and your relationships, you have this ability to throw all those scripts out the window because your scenario doesn't fit the script anyway.
Yeah.
And that's really liberating. I think that that's
Mm-hmm.
really great. And another thing that comes to mind when we're talking about that is like, there's another Canadian researcher, Peggy Kleinplatz, who does research at University of Ottawa. And she's looked at what she calls optimal sexuality. And all of her studies so she recruited couples to talk about couples who self-identify as being a couple who has great sex, right? Like, what does great sex look like? And almost all of her couples are in their like 60s, 70s, and 80s because they've just gotten to this place of like great sex. And she's built this whole model about optimal sexuality around these older folks' experiences of their sexual lives because they've either been with their partner for so long that they've like really gotten into their communication and been able to kind of really navigate that together, or it's a really interesting set of studies. She's been studying that for decades.
Okay, this is so good because I was going to mention that because in the article that I read, there was a mention of a survey and it had said that people in their 60s were, again, in this survey, they were enjoying sex more than they ever had. And they were in their 60s.
Yes. And the research also shows that especially for women's sexuality, female orgasm, that like the orgasm and pleasure experience gets better and better as women get older. With the exception of like, there's usually a little bit of a blip in the context of menopause because of the physical changes that occur. But once you kind of like adjust to those and make the adjustments, I think a lot of that has to do with feeling empowered to ask for what you want and feeling that empowerment to like actually navigate your sexual life in a way that like is you taking control of that.
Okay, let me make sure I heard that. You said it gets better?
Yeah, it
Or
gets
as
better
the older, like, really?
it tends to
Because
get better.
is that well known? I don't know if a lot of people.
So, I mean, well, okay. So the studies that I'm drawing from that, I mean, in terms of measuring better, like in your 20s, women tend to not really articulate their needs in the context of sex. And into your 30s, 40s, and 50s, that's when those needs get articulated. And so those needs getting articulated and like really feeling like they're coming into their own sexual selves in a way where they're no longer as concerned with things like pleasing their partner, or they're really like focused on themselves and focused on like, no, I deserve to like enjoy sex actually. And that piece of that empowerment doesn't come along until mid 30s and later. And so it depends
Wow.
on
Huh.
how, you know, we do see, as I mentioned, some blips in the context of like physical response,
Yeah.
like physiological arousal. There are some shifts there, but overall, I mean, it really does get better when you get older as opposed to.
That is great news.
Yeah.
That's great news for everyone to hear that.
And what's really interesting too in that is I did some research earlier on in my career where I looked at if we're looking at a male-female partnership, like a heterosexual sort of relationship, then men showed that the thing that they wanted most out of their sexual experience was that their partner be satisfied. And so when we see that, and these were men who were in long-term relationships, but that was like really what they wanted, is to see that their partner was satisfied and feeling sexual pleasure. And that is not typically what ends up happening in the context of your 20s and early 30s. So I think that's also promising that would actually, yeah,
that's so encouraging.
Yeah.
You know, when we talked about young people in their 20s and 30s, there was among many of them a kind of fatigue, maybe, or dissatisfaction with dating apps.
Mm-hmm.
And although, you know, we were talking about the pandemic and basically the effect of the pandemic is people had to turn to technology even more.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a given, I guess, as we come out of the pandemic. I'm wondering if for older singles who are dating, you feel that's the case as well, that that's kind of a change that is here to stay. It's going to be technology and maybe an increasing reliance on technology to meet people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I think it's important, just as with the younger generations, to acknowledge the limits of technology and like not rely entirely on staying on the app or like, you know, really moving toward that meeting in real life scenario. I think that safety considerations are really important to keep in mind, especially for people, I mean, for everybody, but especially if you're not as like familiar with using technology. I think there can be some signs of someone not really being who they are saying that they are, that maybe people who aren't as familiar with technology might be less likely to spot. So I would want to make sure like someone was well versed in figuring that stuff out. But certainly technology is here to stay. There's no way that it's it's great. It really is. It allows for you to see others who are also single and also looking for the same things. And you can articulate what it is that you're looking for on there. You can indicate the demographics of the person. You know, so many great things have come from having dating apps.
Yeah. As long, I guess, as you can put up with, you know, the ones maybe that aren't being entirely honest, and you have to kind of go through a lot of that too to get to the good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. There's no avoiding that, I don't think.
and you know, I mean, for all the like the challenges involved in dating when you're older, we were talking, I guess, mostly about heterosexual couples. What about if you're LGBTQ2+? I mean, are the challenges even greater when you're older?
Well, that's interesting. It's hard to say. I think that there's,
Mm.
for instance, like in our clinic that we have, our elders trans and gender expansive group is like the most popular group in because of the fact that there's so few opportunities to connect with others in the context of like just day-to-day life, right? Whereas
Yeah.
if you have a protected space that is LGBTQ friendly, that
Right.
allows for that like safety net to be like, yeah, we can freely express ourselves in the context of this group. And this is a like safe place that we know we're not going to be discriminated against or judged. And so I think that in that way, technology has really benefited a lot of.
Right. So when you say that it's your most popular, do you mean that that you're getting a lot of interest in it from people who are LGBTQ?
Yes.
Is that
So we have
okay?
it's a group therapy approach, and so we have like a very long wait list
Oh,
on our elders trans. Yeah,
yeah,
it's also garnered a lot of attention from across the country just because of the fact that it's a group that gets ignored a lot of the time. But like
right.
trans people have been around for as long as cisgender people have been around,
Yeah, yeah.
and so and LGBTQ people have been around forever too. It's not like this is new. And so
Hmm.
those folks are aging and they are experiencing things related to aging that can really benefit from community and from feeling seen and heard from that
Yeah.
community.
It almost makes me wonder. I mean, of so many factors involved, as you say, there's safety. There's the small community of people who are, who suffer perhaps similar challenges. But I'm
Hmm.
also just wondering too about the size, because the pool is small. It makes me wonder too. When you now take it over to the mainstream heterosexual, dating community, is there just too much choice sometimes? And that's what people get what? There's just on the dating apps, right? There's just so much choice. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of choice in the LGBTQ community too. It depends on where you live and if you have like a large city nearby, or if you, and I think that choice, that idea of choice is a fallacy, right? It's like, it's not actually, there's not limitless choice because it just seems like there is. It just seems like there's a lot of
Yeah.
choice. And really, though, the number of people who you're going to be actually compatible with and actually wanting to go on a second date with, and actually, that is hard to find. It is
Yeah.
hard to get to. And so there's this sort of illusion of choice that exists in the context of dating apps that is an illusion.
That's a really good thing to keep in mind. You're right. It is an
Yeah,
illusion because once you start narrowing it down, it gets maybe to a small pool after all.
totally. Yeah.
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 And I guess, I don't know, do you get the sense too? And again, just going back to, midlife older adults, that because they are at that age, they're pickier maybe than when they were younger because they
I
know
mean,
what they want.
they know what they want, and like, why waste time? And I wish that 20-year-olds did this too, but like, why waste time with someone that you don't really think you want to spend time with?
Yeah.
You get more selective because your time is precious. And there is sort of this feeling of like, no, I'm a fully formed adult that doesn't really actually need to be in a relationship. I want to maybe be in a relationship because it's fulfilling in a few different ways that I'm looking for. But there's not that same level of like pressure, social pressure or need for that
Hmm.
as there is, again, getting rid of those scripts. Like, yeah. And I think
And
we're starting to see a shift in the younger generations too around being single by choice and that being okay. And like people acknowledging, like, yeah, you can be single by choice. And many
oh,
people are incredibly happy as single people, right?
I am so glad you brought that in. I was thinking about being single and I thought, oh, that's a whole other podcast. And I probably will do like a whole other podcast on being single, but I think it's important we bring that up
Yeah.
because I don't want to I mean, this is about people who are interested in dating and having relationships, but I think it's important to bring up that not everybody is. And
Right.
they're perfectly happy being single. And do you know that article? Actually, I just found it. There was a line, and I want to read this to you. It was from this woman because it really struck me. And she's this single woman, and she said she pulled back from dating for a while. And she said, I don't think there's one love of your life. I think there's love. and she's sharing her love in all kinds of ways. She reaches out to people in her community. She reminds her kids that she adores them. She hosts these dinners for her congregation. And then she was asked whether she was happy being single. And she said, you come into this world by yourself, but somewhere along the line, we get this idea that you're part of a half. You are whole, all to yourself. I
Yeah.
really like that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Mm-hmm.
Wait,
Yeah, and
what do
I
you think
think
of it? Yeah.
yeah, I think like to be able to articulate that and be genuinely okay with that, I think is a hard thing to do in
Mm-hmm.
our culture. And so it's wonderful. And I think that that's like how many people might feel, but they might feel this sort of pressure to engage in dating because so many people around them are partnered or and part of that too has to do with making sure that you have a solid social support network outside of a romantic relationship. So it sounds like her life is very full and is very full of
Mm-hmm.
love and is incredibly enriching. And you can imagine though, if you're somebody who doesn't maybe have all of that and who doesn't have that sort of social circle that really feeds them and really fuels them, that can be harder
Yeah.
to get on board
Yeah.
with that aloneness.
Yeah. Because again, too, on the other side, there are many singles who are lonely.
There
They're
are.
very,
And there
yeah.
are many people
Yeah.
in long-term relationships who are incredibly lonely, right?
Yes.
There are lots of people who are in
Yeah.
relationships that are lonely.
Yeah. You know,
So,
the other area we haven't really touched on are people who are, well, more elderly and are living in seniors' homes.
hmm,
And I can imagine there must be all kinds of challenges that are unique to that environment, right? They want to date, but there've got to be privacy issues around that. It's such a small community. You know, there's like their peer pressure. What do other people say? Their children maybe who come and visit them. There must be all kinds of, right, things
yeah.
involved in that whole scenario.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of considerations there. Some places allow for there to be like certain times of day where people get privacy, or if you have shared rooms, like there's sometimes a separate room that people can go to in order to get their intimacy needs met, whether that's through masturbation or through partnered activities. And so those are sort of the um, more in tune with those needs places.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
so is that not a common? That's not a common thing, or is it growing? Do you know? I mean, is that
I'm
being
not
acknowledged?
sure. I
Ah,
would love to know. I know when I first
yeah.
sort of learned about it, they were trying to. It was in the context of pulling research for showing how important sexual well being is to overall well being, and that was sort of their argument. Was like their argument to their board or whatever was this that sexual well-being is incredibly important to overall well-being, and so why should we not be allowing this to take place here? But it's certainly a consideration, especially if you're someone who's like looking at places to go for assisted living. Like, do they value this, and is this something that is important to them as well? And there's been some headlines from, there was that one place, that one assisted living area in Florida where they had a huge, I think it was a chlamydia outbreak. They had a huge chlamydia outbreak because there's so just statistically speaking, men don't live as long as women, and so there were fewer men who were engaging in sex with women, and they just spread chlamydia across this entire, because there was no contraception being used, no barrier method being used, no condoms because of lack of
Oh,
concern about pregnancy, right?
right,
Beyond reproductive
right.
years at that age. And so there was like this really important like public health outbreak
Oh
that
my
happened that they needed to
goodness!
address. Yeah.
Wow. Uh, do you know? Yeah. I mean, with the pandemic and that changing the landscape and technology and our further reliance on it, I don't know. How do you see things? If you had to look into a crystal ball, as far as like midlife older people, c- could you see maybe in sort of a couple of years, 5 years, I don't know, 10 years, how things might be progressing as far as their dating?
I think it's only going to get better, honestly. I think, we've talked about technology burnout and that kind of thing, but there's also a lot of really great things that technology brings. So there's things like even t-shirts you can wear that like hug you when you press a button, or like those types of things. And I think that getting your intimacy needs met in a variety of different ways can be, I think we're just seeing an increase in the different ways that intimacy can be achieved. And then also the sort of increase in acceptability, and as our population ages, that increase in acceptability and in openness to living a very healthy sexual life until the day you die. I mean, that sex can look a lot of different ways. And I think that having that healthy, optimal sexuality sort of model of looking at why it's so important to continue to be intimate with yourself and with others, if that's your choice too.
Yeah, I guess, um, a lot of it too, I feel, is just information being accessible to people, right? Because if you don't know it, then you don't know it. You don't
Right.
know that it's out there. You don't know that it's available. So it makes me think of you and how, you communicate this research that you do, your studies, your findings. How important is that for you to get it out to the public, right? Not just have
Yeah.
it in a journal, and to do these kinds of interviews.
Oh, totally. It's so important. It's always been such an important part of the work that I do. I think if we keep our findings stuck behind paywalls in an academic journal, like what are we even doing? I mean, that's important. It's important for a lot of reasons within the context of academia, but especially in sex and relationships work. I mean, this stuff is so interesting and people are so thirsty for information because we don't get any of it anywhere else, right? And
Right.
so, and additionally, there's a lot of voices out there that maybe don't know much about the science and are trying their best to kind of like translate things. But if you don't understand the science, then I feel like, they're always very excited to talk to us and like have us translate that for them. And that is really important to the work that we do. Also,
Yeah.
our work in journal articles is written in such jargony, boring.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean,
It's
you can't
often
even
really
understand
boring.
it. Yeah.
It's often
You know,
really boring. And so I think our findings are really exciting and really, really applicable to people's everyday lives. And that piece is, that's just really important.
yeah.
Part of, to me, it's part of like my ethical, like I require myself to do that as a scientist. I think that that's,
You know what? I also thought you were going to say there's also a lot of misinformation and just right out there. And so if people are, they're kind of nervous, they really don't know where to look, and then they're going online, they may be seeing all kinds of stuff that it's just wrong. It's incorrect.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So I also feel an ethical obligation to flood that and make sure that none of that stuff comes to the surface. Right. You're so right. There's so much misinformation out there.
Can you, I mean, without, saying any names or whatever, but can you think of, I don't know, someone in the past, just an example of someone who's really benefited from being educated in this area, like from research, or maybe someone you helped, or just the difference it made?
Oh, well, related to our topic that we're talking about now, this was pretty recent. I had contributed to an article in the Star Tribune here in Minneapolis about kissing and about the power of a kiss and how kissing gets sort of pushed to the wayside so often in long-term relationships and also as people age. And I had someone contact me and say, I read your article about kissing and my husband had died. Her husband had died. And it was just, she said she had not even thought about her future because she just was so stuck in grief. And she was just so stuck in losing him. And she had been caregiving for him for quite a few years before that. And she said that reading this article just made her be like, oh my gosh, like I want to kiss someone again. Like I want to have those butterflies and like that excitement of like kissing someone, just kissing them. And I sort of didn't know how the article was going to go, right? Like I haven't really done an article on something as specific as the kiss, but it ended up being a great article, but additionally, the fact that this woman like took that away from it and then reached out to me and talked to me about it and said, this has really broadened my horizons and kind of given me like that fire that I needed to push me toward dating, because she's like, I see hope in that. Like that is so true, that a kiss is really powerful and I want to feel that again. And so that's a really recent example of that happening. And it happens all the time. Like I really do hear often from people that really hadn't thought about something, or like didn't know that research was being done on this, or where they like learned so much misinformation growing up because people are so uncomfortable talking about it. They like never felt like they could ask, people like are really nervous to ask
Yeah.
these questions. And so sometimes you just have to provide the answers and know that someone's listening who maybe needs that.
Yeah, it's too bad, isn't it? Because as much as we have become more open, there are still so much that is it's so much like that is shut down and still stigma around it that people are nervous. So I can see if they come across you and you're very open, you're very approachable, they probably say, "Can I ask you something?" Like
Yeah, oh,
and
totally.
then right?
Yeah, any cocktail party I'm ever at, it's
Yeah.
like I always get at least one person like pulling me aside or like following me to the washroom. Like,
Yeah. You know what it
I
is?
just want to ask you a really quick question.
Yeah. Oh, that's exactly. I interviewed this doctor who's a family doctor, and he would say, "You know what? It's so interesting because the most important question, and sometimes it's a sexual one or whatever. He goes, it'll always come at the end.
Oh,
They didn't.
absolutely.
They didn't come in and ask me at the beginning. No, we go through everything, and then right at the end, it's like hand on the door question as they're ready to go. By the way, I really would like to ask you this.
Yes, this
All
even
right?
happens
Is
in
it?
a 55-minute therapy session. I'll be like working with a client and then it'll just sort of be like slow. And I'm like, so what did you want to talk about today? Is there anything you're thinking about here? And then, we'll have like 10 minutes left and they'll drop some bomb.
Yeah. Do you know what? If there's one thing that you've learned from your work and just also your encounters with patients and the public about dating or relationships in midlife, people who are nervous and seeking that, can you share anything? One thing you think is really important that you've
I
come
think,
to
yeah, I
know?
think it's important to just acknowledge that, like, the pursuit of sexual pleasure and the pursuit of that happiness in a romantic relationship or in your sex life is completely normal throughout the lifespan. And so that is something that, like, it's not weird to want to pursue that. It's not weird it is totally normal to have that be something that you want and that you want to prioritize. Like, we are, we get benefits from that throughout our entire lives. And that doesn't just stop at some age, regardless of what society might tell us that sexuality looks like in older age.
Yeah. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's so positive and, you're so approachable and kind of all embracing of what's out there. So I think people will leave this, I'm hoping anyway, with a much more positive and hopeful look at, their relationships and dating.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah.
Thanks,
It is
Kristen.
hopeful out there. Thank you.
Thanks. That's Kristen Mark. She's a Canadian sex and relationships researcher currently working in the US as a professor at the University of Minnesota at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Health. To find out more about Kristen and her work, you can check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast, Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram podcast. Thanks for listening. See you here next time.